Grazie mille, Federico. And for many years, the only thing I could say in Italian was Alfa Romeo Spider Veloce, because I owned this beautiful car in the United States, and I had to sell it when I moved to Brussels 2 years ago. But I still have my Bianchi, so I very much support the efforts of Presidente Catania and others to protect Italian craftsmanship around the world. And indeed, we are here today because the great products of Italian craftsmanship include film and television. I only have to mention spectacularly successful titles like La Grande Bellezza and Venuto al Mondo to remind you of that fantastic success as we sit here in the House of Cinema. And thank you, Christina, for working on my pronunciation. Of course, the international industry is very much involved in partnership with local industries throughout Europe. You see that here in the very strong involvement of the MPA member companies in local production. For example, Warner's La Migliore Offerta, which was directed by Academy Award winner Giuseppe Tornatore, is just one of many examples where the member companies of the Motion Picture Association are involved in local and diverse language production in Europe. Of course, Italy is also a fantastic shooting location. Recent films like The Man from U.N.C.L.E., Everest, and Spectre were all partially filmed in Rome, as well as other prime locations throughout Italy. And we are looking forward to upcoming releases such as The Young Messiah from NBC Universal, Ben-Hur from Paramount, and Inferno from Sony. Against that background of collaboration, the digital single market, or DSM, is an important issue for all of us, and it's what I'd like to focus on in my remarks today. Let me say first that I feel it's quite important that we begin by distinguishing between the EU single market as a broad economic and political project and some specific aspects of the digital single market proposals that are now under development. You can be a huge supporter of the EU single market, as I'm sure many of us in this room today are. But it is still all right to question whether what is specifically being proposed in the name of the digital single market really makes sense for our sector, for the audiovisual sector. In fact, I would argue it is our obligation in Europe's creative sector to our audiences and to the 7 million people who work in this field to assess whether some of the current proposed plans have the potential to cause harm to jobs and growth. We should, I think, cast a particularly critical eye on any proposal that touches the principles of licensing on the basis of exclusive rights and contractual freedom that have long served as the foundation for the financial success of the audiovisual industry. Some of these principles are being questioned today in ways that has not previously been the case. It is possible that the European Commission, in its understandable enthusiasm for the single market, has inadvertently confused the freedom to serve all of Europe with an obligation to serve all of Europe in particular ways that may not make sense for the audiovisual sector. The vision that the European Commission is pursuing reflects in some respects that kind of confusion. I believe it's a confusion that is born in part of a misapprehension that Europe is home to a monolithic pan-European audience. I ask you as leaders of the film and television community, is that really the case? Is there anything in your experience that assures you that films and television shows that are popular in Germany will also be appealing in Sweden or Italy? Is it correct to assume that the types of comedy that people in London love will be received the same way in Barcelona or Bologna? that movie fans in Reims or Regensburg or Riga or Rome all want to enjoy film and television series in the same ways or on the same platforms. Of course, the question is absurd. One great example from the experience of the member companies of the MPA is music television, MTV. When MTV first tried launching in Europe almost 30 years ago, they created a single set of programming and a single channel to be shown all across Europe. Everyone saw the same thing, no matter which country you traveled to. They didn't take into account the different musical tastes, they didn't take into account the linguistic diversity, and they didn't take into account the different audience expectations. That model did not succeed the way they would have wanted it to. And over time, MTV Europe began to diversify its model into different localized offerings that were tailored for individual audiences. Those offerings have now been tremendously successful, in large part because they provided programming tailored to their audiences and their preferences, rather than a single homogeneous product for all of Europe. Now, in the movies, sometimes just wanting it, just wishing it to be so, is enough. Sometimes in the movies, a voice speaks to you in a cornfield and says, "If you build it, he will come." But I think the MTV experience illustrates that in real life, sometimes you build it and they do not come. And who bears the risk if we build it and they do not come? It is not the European Commission that bears the risk. It's the people in this room and the people who come to work every day to make that film or television series. It's all of us and the people we employ and collaborate with. A recent study that was commissioned by the European Commission itself further proves the point that there isn't a digital single culture in Europe. According to the Eurobarometer study, consumer habits and viewing patterns have grown increasingly individualized across Europe. Only 8% of consumers have tried to access content online that was designed for other countries, suggesting that they prefer content tailored to their specific needs rather than generic pan-European offerings. Put simply, instead of becoming more homogenized, European consumer habits and viewing patterns have actually grown increasingly individualized, diverse, and focused on domestic creations. That focus is why the option of territorial licensing is so important for Europe's film community. The contractual freedom to experiment with innovative offerings for local audiences and to make deals that meet the needs of local and national platforms is key to meeting consumer demand for content that meets their localized expectations. So rather than forcing all manner of content on consumers, we in the audiovisual sector are used to trying to cater to what they want. And far from preventing cross-border services or stifling sharing between markets, the current framework enables content distribution on multiple different bases: linguistic, territorial, multi-country, and yes, pan-European, where that's an offering that matches up with consumer demand. If there is enough demand and a viable product, service providers can absolutely deliver cross-border product, and copyright owners can work with them to do that under the existing system. But the consumer and the creator will be best served, I think, if those decisions continue to be based on market demand rather than on government regulation. One myth I'd like to dispel is that we have a digital single market in the US, because sometimes people say to me, if you've got it in the US, why can't we have it in Europe as well? What we have in the United States is a market of exclusive rights and contractual freedom. There is no mandated digital single market in the United States. There is freedom to license locally, regionally, or nationally, depending on what the rights holder and the platform think their audience wants. It is up to the copyright owners and their business partners in the United States to figure out how to make audiences happy. Here in Europe, of course, we have much greater cultural and linguistic diversity. So the approach of contractual freedom to meet local audience demand makes a great deal of sense. Consider this. The physical distance between Los Angeles and Seattle is pretty similar to the physical distance between Rome and Warsaw. The cultural distance between Rome and Warsaw bears no resemblance to the cultural distance between Los Angeles and Seattle. So if copyright owners, in fact, choose to serve those markets in different ways in Europe, I think we owe it to them to support those choices and give them the contractual freedom to make that. And in fact, I would argue that Europe's... So sorry. In fact, I would argue that it would be a serious mistake to pretend that there's a single market when there isn't. While contractual freedom and licensing play an important role in ensuring that audiences have access to the content that they want, the importance really goes much farther than just pleasing the audience. Those freedoms also protect the ability of our industries to operate and to ensure that the millions of jobs relying on those industries continue to exist. They're key sources of financing that are vital to the continued growth and sustainability of the film and television ecosystem in Europe. Of course, the film and television community is continuously evolving creatively and technologically to meet consumer demands and provide the choices that audiences are seeking. I think it's fair to say that in the film and TV sector, we're champions of innovation. We're tirelessly experimenting with business models that deliver creative works to consumers. In fact, today, European consumers have, according to the European Audiovisual Observatory, access to over 3,000 audiovisual online services in Europe. All the same, creating movies and TV series is a high-risk experimental business. It requires big upfront investments with no guarantee of making a profit or even recouping those initial investments. But one thing we can guarantee is that without the financing that comes from licensing and territorial agreements, some productions will never get the chance to try. They won't even have the chance to be made. That means lost jobs, lost wages, and damage to the ecosystem that undergirds all film production in Europe, whether it's local or international. So I invite all of you to help deliver the message that the framework we have today is the foundation for 7 million jobs and 509 billion euros of GDP. We must not gamble those jobs based on mere whispers in a cornfield about some possible future demand. Instead, we need to preserve the freedom to serve Europe's diverse markets in the way that meets the demands of individual markets and individual productions. You know, our industry is a great one to work in because we have an enormous impact on individuals, their relationships, on culture overall, on society at large. No one entertains, enlightens, informs, inspires, and educates the way that the film and television industry can do. So let me conclude by saying that there's a lot at stake here. The stakes are bigger than just a commercial distribution issue. It's important that our EU leaders get the digital single market right. I am reassured by the presence of Presidente Costa today and so many other leaders from the Italian industry that we have the right we have the right voice, we have the right conversation going on about how to do that in partnership between Europe's leaders and the leaders of the audiovisual sector. I look forward to the panel this afternoon as an opportunity to begin that conversation with an animated discussion. And thank you again, Federico and FAPAV, for inviting me here today.
Grazie mille. E se ci sono domande per Stan? Domande?
Yeah, please. Very happy to.
Hi, This morning during the meeting, Stan, several of the speakers made reference to the opportunity or to the need to have an harmonization of the EU rules on anti-piracy. What do you think about this?
Well, here's my worry. I would love to believe that we are going to get a significant strengthening of anti-piracy rules at a European level. It doesn't seem like an accident to me that we will hear the European Commission's proposals on exceptions and limitations and on other aspects of copyright substance long before we hear any ideas from them on enforcement of copyright. I think there's a danger that that ultimately what happens is that we get sort of more symbolic proposals on the enforcement side. Now, all that is, please don't take me the wrong way. I think the follow the money approaches and other things that are being discussed by the European Commission are very important. But I also don't think, I don't think we should believe for a moment that it's okay to reduce the value of the rights and then balance that by saying the rights will be better enforced. We need to preserve the value of the rights, and that includes the freedom to license them in the way that the licensees want, in the way that gives the most value to them and their audiences.